This is ION Hong Kong with Key.
And this is Harminder, and we'll be discussing the top news for the week involving Hong Kong and China.
Welcome back to the second part of ION Hong Kong, and we have our guest, independent journalist Richard.
Hello.
Hello.
Hi.
Maybe you have to come closer to the mic. Thank you.
All right, so that was just a general overview of the protests last week. Well,
where was it?
Sheung Shui, Tuen Mun, and Tsim Sha Tsui. I'm not sure exactly which location that one was from, but generally that's what was going on those three locations.
Yeah.
Right? And you know, a lot has been made of this latest protests. There were, again, some arrests. The thing is that this time it was held in three locations, three moving protests, one after the other. So how did that come about? Was that spontaneous, or was that organized before? Yeah.
It's been on the cards for a few weeks now to move. For me, that was the most significant thing about these protests. You know, that obviously around the edges of these protests, there are people acting badly, but generally the protests, people aren't. You know, there's not 300 people rampaging through whatever place there is. You're talking about 300, 400 people moving through a place, you know, making a noise, making an issue of what they're doing. But, you know, it's only around the edges that you do have bad behaviour going on. And there was bad behaviour going on. I mean, I'm not going to deny that, you know, some of the behaviour that happens, I don't like. I support the protest, but I don't like, I think there's surplus to requirement, right? So, generally, you could see from that clip that, you know, people are not behaving badly.
Right.
People are just moving through the shopping centres and shouting, and then obviously if there are people who then maybe attack or insult the protesters, then these protesters, they will rise to that.
Okay.
They will rise to that.
And knowing mainstream media, they're only going to pick the bad parts of the protest. They're not going to show generally what happened. So if we see in the next clip, clip 3, this is one of the clips that have been making the rounds. So we'll take a look at that. You know, the famous one of
course.
the mother being supposedly yelled at, and they kicked her bag, and she opened her bag and revealed that there were school books. But what made it worse was that her daughter there was crying I mean, later on in the clip, you see her crying and being hysterical. But, of course, the mother didn't stop and pick up her child and console her or anything. She just went on and on and on until the end.
Sure.
So what's the backstory from this clip?
Okay. So the first thing I want to say about these clips and all the clips is that now with the social media, you can build up your own picture of what you think's happened. So, you know, if you just sit there and watch the TV and say that's what happened, then I think you're getting quite a myopic view of what's happening.
Because that's what now all the politicians are focusing on, is that clip right there.
I mean, as an outsider, I think it looks quite bad. I mean, when you are bullying the mother and the daughter, it's quite bad.
Sure. The background to that clip, right, is that the protests had shifted to Tuen Mun quite quickly,
right,
and it completely outstepped the police. There were no police. At that point, when that clip happened, the protesters had gathered, and the main group of protesters had moved into V City, which is the opposite direction, and a group of protesters had said, "There's some." Parallel smugglers, there's some smugglers, and they're around the corner and they're packing their bags. So they then went around to those smugglers, and that's when you see at the start of the main clip, you see them moving them on and being quite abusive to those smugglers. And so we followed that group of people. It was a small group of people, probably 10 to 15 people, right? and they were moving the smugglers on. And then as we moved round the corner, right, we walked onto the end of that cliff, right? And my initial reaction was, that's not cool. That's not cool. There's a mother with a daughter, and she's crying and she's shouting. And it was mainly media that were around her by the time we got there. And when I mean media, I mean like a circus around her. Maybe 10.
Mainstream and
not really independent,
mostly
like mainstream media. You know, and there's a big difference between the type of journalism we do, where we're like non-invasive,
right,
and the mainstream media, which is anytime there's any situation, they're almost as dangerous as the police moving forward, because it's a full-on pile onto whatever's happening.
Right.
So she was pretty much surrounded by mainstream media at that point. And what was interesting was that she was shouting up the street at the protesters who'd left her. Now, my initial reaction is not cool. They've got into an argument with this woman. I didn't know the backstory,
right,
but I presume that they'd maybe insulted her or something, and then she was shouting back. And then we left because there was nothing we could do. And we're not that type of media that, you know, like gets the photographs. We're more, like I said, less invasive. So we moved on, and I came away thinking that's not cool. And that was, for me, that was it for the end of the day. I didn't really consider that. And then on the Monday morning, I woke up and saw what a firestorm that was going to be. And then I wrote something about when you watch the video, you know, all I was saying was my personal opinion is she could have moved on. Okay. I'm not denying that they were insulting to her, right? But I would have. She didn't seem to want to move on. She seemed to want to create a situation that was far bigger. Yeah, okay. And that's what these protests are about. These protests are about. They're really rough around the edges, and if you confront these protesters, they will confront you back. Right, and that's what's made the message so much more amplified. Right. Whereas in a protest where you can put 10,000 people on the street and they all walk silently to the government buildings, right? Yeah. The impact of that compared to putting 500 people on the street, and anybody who challenges them, they will then be challenged. Suddenly, it's like a force multiplier.
And with that being said, do you think that as the protests have gone on, starting from the first one to this one, they're getting more and more confrontational with
No.
No?
No.
It's about the same?
No, it's the same. It's the same. There was the same amount of confrontation in Taipo. In fact, there was more confrontation in Taipo when they challenged Letitia Lee. Right,
well,
that was
Letitia
way more. And now Letitia Lee's desperate to get more publicity. So she's banging on the door of Civic Passion, and because these guys, they won't touch Letitia Lee now because they don't want to give her oxygen. So, and then then we had, what was the next one after that? It was Tunmun, right? And then Tunmun, there was a at the top of the escalator when I got pushed down the escalator. That was a war zone. It was like a full-on war zone, and then we had Yuen Long again. There was these protesters. They won't back down from a confrontation.
Right.
And so I don't think there was in Tunmun there was any more violence than there was. I think that there's more press there.
I actually want to ask about these protests. People, it seems that they're pointing their fingers at Civic Passion. What was their involvement with these protests?
They don't organise these protests. Civic Passion. I think supporters of Civic Passion go to the protests, especially Tunmun. This weekend, Tunmun, there was no organisation at all. That was basically social media. Of course, people who are there go to support Civic Passion or they support Hong Kong Indigenous, but there is no coordination. There is no, this is what we're doing, this is how we're going to do it.
Because from the Facebook, from all these comments from the other political parties, it seems that they're all pointing the fingers at Jen Chung Tai. I just wonder why, because I thought...
because they're like an enemy? They need to blame someone. I don't. In Yuen Long, Civic Passion, they left at 6 o'clock. They literally, they left.
That's actually one of the points that people criticizing them, because they said they started off something and then they stirred up something and then they left so early, and then you think the trouble behind. Was it that was the case?
Not at all.
You said the last time they packed up their flags early and left.
It was so chaotic. You know, when we walked through Yuen Long, the police just had no control over the situation. It was just it was like a big mix-up of Civic Passion, Hong Kong Indigenous, independent protesters, police, blue ribbons, maybe some triad. It was just a big milkshake, right? And I remember I actually lost the protest. And I stood around, I looked around, and suddenly I look around and I was thinking, who are these people around me? I suddenly felt quite intimidated. And I tried to ask some policemen where the protest was. And they couldn't speak English. So then I saw a Western policeman. And I went up to the Western policeman and I said, do you know where the protest is? And he kind of laughed, like jokingly, just like, and he said, I have no idea. Right? It was just a big mess, right? And then what happened was...
but the narrative is it's so organized, they know where to go, they're going in packs, you know.
No, not at all. It's not at all. So we lost Hong Kong Indigenous. I was trying to follow Hong Kong Indigenous, and I lost them. That's how crazy it is. I mean, you know, how can you lose like 30 guys in blue jackets with flags? That's how crazy it was. And so then what happened was that I then went back to the train station, and Civic Passion had arrived back at the train station. And so we just stood there thinking that maybe Civic Passion and some of those guys maybe wouldn't have left if people had then rallied back to the MTR station. But what unbeknownst to us, people had already moved on and started to congregate by Castle Peak Road. And we had no clue that this was happening. One of the reasons was because all the Western journalists that we communicate with on Twitter, we'd all lost the protest. So we all ended up back at the MTR station. So we all ended up watching Civic Passion pack up their flags and leave. And I think Civic Passion left because they thought, it's over.
Okay.
It's over.
So,
they waited for like 40 minutes. They just stood there. They just stood at the MTR station for 40 minutes going, well, what's happening?
All right. We'll play clip 1 now. And here's another one that's been going a little viral about during those protests. I'm not sure exactly where this took place, which protest site, but as the clip plays...
Sure. I was here. I was there. I'm just to the right. Yeah. This is just the road leading up to the main entrance to the Tuen Mun MTR station.
Okay, so this is Tuen Mun still?
Yes.
Okay. And eventually they seem to surround one guy and kick him in the back.
Yeah.
And he goes, sprawling and
Sure.
It makes for... Again, it looks like that the protesters right here.
Well, you see him hit him something. You see him hit him, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So there's the backstory, right? That's what happened.
He had the first blow.
Yeah, but
then you see like 6-7 guys jump on him.
So basically, what happened is, the Hong Kong police have created an atmosphere where these type of uncles think that they can walk into crowds of people and insult them and get away with it, right? And that's been created from the very first day that they said the triads.
Gangster-looking uncle there with his necklace.
He's a gangster, right? He's a blue ribbon, right?
Right there, boom.
Yeah, boom.
He gets kicked right.
So what happened, right, was that this guy, he goes into the crowd as per usual. They're acting really violently, right? And in the past, right, these guys get away with it, right? And people, Hong Kong people are pretty passive. Even these protesters are pretty passive.
You think so?
on a world scale, right?
Well, on a world scale, yes.
On a world scale.
On a Hong Kong scale, this is considered
very
like
sure. No, I agree. But I agree. But these people are the people that were beaten by blue ribbons. The people in Mong Kok that got beaten by blue ribbons. These are the protesters that are on the streets now.
And they've had enough. So this guy walks into the crowd, starts acting. He started punching first.
He started punching first, which the media obviously is not interested in. And I was just to the right of this guy.
Right.
And again, for me, as a Western person, I'm always amazed at how passive the Hong Kong protesters are. Because, I'm just thinking, if this was 200 Western people, and a single person walked into the crowd and started a fight, right, he would be hospitalized.
He would.
He would be hospitalized.
Yeah.
And so this guy starts throwing his weight around, and this crowd was not interested. And the most significant thing that happened to him, you can see on that clip, is he starts pushing and fighting and punching, and someone gives him an almighty hook on the side of the head. You can actually see it, right? And that is a big punch, right? It really, they come down, and that stopped him dead in his tracks, because he literally thought, well, these people mean business,
right?
And that's why he then started to basically to become introverted. You can see him start to become introverted, because he's suddenly thinking,
out his phone trying to record.
This isn't a normal crowd. Right. You know, I thought that I could walk into this crowd and throw my weight around. They're just a bunch of kids, and suddenly they're just going no. And then after that, you see another person kick him down, and he does the right thing. Then he stays down on the floor and gets his phone out, because if he'd have stood up,
he would have gotten kicked again, probably. But wasn't that kick a little excessive? Now he stopped. He knew he got his. But
I think you know what, right?
Whipped, so
I'm not going to condone violence, because I don't go to these protests for Hong Kong people to.
Because I can understand the first part. He threw the first punch. They retaliated. Well, it was more like, I'd say that was more self-defense than anything, because he could have kept going if they didn't protect themselves, which kind of just showing you can't just punch us and not get anything back. But then he stopped, and then somebody gives him a Mortal Kombat kick in the back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sure, for sure, it's excessive force. But what happened after that was what's really critical, and the media completely missed it. Was after that, 3 blue ribbons within minutes of that happening came into the crowd, and they were basically assaulting everybody, and they were really intimidating. The one guy's really famous, right? The guy with the grey vest on. Did you see the video with the grey vest? And they were in exceptionally aggressive, and people were intimidated by those guys.
So they didn't fight back.
The crowd didn't fight back, because they were super intimidating, and those guys were trying to start to fight with anybody, right? So by that point, the crowd is then ripped into a real high state, and then right after that, the police ran 10 yards up into the crowd and arrested 4 random people, to which they then took them on the bus and beat them up. Do you mean? So, these, I'm not condoning the violence, and I'm not saying they're justified in doing it, right? But you have to understand that it's like a slippery slope of violence, right? And it started with the police and the blue ribbons. That's the cause of it, right? These people are angry. They're angry that there's no justice, right? So none of those blue ribbons got arrested. That guy didn't get arrested. There was previously to that, there was a guy who did touched a woman on her chest. They cornered him. The police didn't even come. They didn't even come. They wouldn't come. I waited for 10, 15 minutes, and the man slowly made his way out to the police, and the police escorted him away. So there's a serious disconnect, and the way the justice is being dispensed. For sure, if the police can find that guy and arrest him for kicking that person,
sure, then it'd be fair. But
it's fair, but it's like, what about the guys who then went in and started the violence?
This is the problem right now we're having in the city, is that suddenly we're having this 2-tier justice system, where people that are considered troublemakers, and this is all down to the training. It's not down really to the individual police officer. They're being trained to do this because they cannot act like this without approval. So they're getting their marching orders saying, arrest these troublemakers, but leave the other ones alone. They're somehow the good guys defending Hong Kong and its core values.
I mean, there's actually some clips on the internet of me just after that incident arguing with the police. I wouldn't say I was arguing. I was imploring the senior officer on site to arrest the blue ribbons. And I was saying to him, I will make a statement, arrest those guys there. And a blue-shirted policeman got to me and he said, shut up or I'm going to arrest you. And I said...
Under what charge?
Exactly. I said to him, you can't arrest me. I haven't done anything. Arrest those guys. And they were not interested. They weren't remotely interested.
I'm quite surprised that nowadays a policeman would just say something like that to a journalist, and when someone stand up for justice, and then they say, "I will arrest you because you're speaking." I mean, that's quite outrageous.
How dare you speak to a nobleman?
I think the police probably recognise me now, but I don't actually wear my journalist pass around my neck.
Right.
usually, because, like I said,
but even a general citizen should be able to come up to a police officer and say, this is what I witnessed. You need to arrest them. You saw what happened, and you need to take them in, and I'll make a witness statement. We got video clips and everything.
They're not interested. They're really not interested at all. Their agenda is to
intimidate.
And I just want to say one last thing about that clip as well. Is that I think everyone was heading towards the MTR station, and it was kind of winding down. I mean, they walked into that guy with the bald head who was then aggressive, and then the three guys came in who were aggressive, and then the man with the trolley came again who was aggressive, right? I don't think they should have knocked his trolley over. I don't think they should, but these crowds, they open up for pushchairs, they open up for disabled people. People come through saying, I'm a disabled person. The crowds open up. It's not a closed cell of bodies that can't pass.
Go around.
So if your uncle with the parrot, if he'd have said, excuse me, right, there would have been nothing. There would have been no incident there. But the fact that Hong Kong's society is so broken that your uncle with the parrot thinks he can abuse 200 kids on the street and get away with it. Right now, I would say that's just not reality.
And the uncle with the parrot, for our viewers, who was that?
Okay, so there was an old man who I don't know his backstory too well, but he seemed to have a cart full of all kinds of things, just like his life almost. And maybe
homeless.
Just around the corner from where the incident took place, there was a park. So he was probably located in that park, making.
But do you think he was homeless?
I don't
Maybe?
know.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know his backstory really. I mean, I know that they've interviewed him.
He had a parrot?
He seemed to be going home or moving his parrot or moving his trolley, which was stacked high of all kinds of stuff.
Right.
Now he moved that straight into the crowd, pushed it straight into the crowd. Right. And there's nothing, no doubt in my mind that if he had just said excuse me, right, the crowd would have opened up for him. Right. But he was immediately aggressive towards them because of his political views. He clearly doesn't think that they should be there, and he feels like they're bad. Which that's fine, but I don't think, again, like with the woman, I don't think that's the right time to air your views, right? If you're I don't adhere to the idea that anybody can air their views whenever they want, right? For example, if I'm standing in front of 200 neo-Nazis from Europe, I'm not going to turn around and insult them.
People can air their views, they just have to accept the consequences that are going to come from that.
So that's what happened with that one. And so what happened was he then moved through the crowd airing his views, and he has the right to freedom of speech, but and then somebody I think kicked his trolley, but not in a kind of kicked it over, but just kind of gave it a bit of a
but
shut
still,
up. Yeah, I agree. I mean, escalating the violence.
Right. But, why escalate it?
What?
Why escalate it?
Because these
I know he's speaking crap, right? He's speaking trash to the crowd and everything, but you're just escalating it by kicking the trolley.
But what you've got right.
Say a few words and let him be.
But what you've got right, like I said, is that you've got 200 people, probably by that point, of which only a few percent are of the mind to keep people's trolleys.
Yeah, there's a small minority.
A small percent, but then once that escalates, more people will be getting involved, right? So it's not like 200 people running through Tuen Mun, kicking over every trolley they see. Right.
But again, they're going to focus just on those incidents.
Exactly. And but ultimately, I probably get some criticism for this now. Ultimately, this kind of publicity isn't really. It's manageable. Like the police manage their violence, right? They turn around and go, it's manageable. File a complaint with Capo, right? They justify their actions and any kind of excessive actions. They just go, well, it's part of policing. Andy Jang would say it's only natural. Right?
But do you think that these kind of protests effective?
Yeah, of course they are.
So
it's not even arguable.
I think it is, because look at the response that just came out of China from the Commerce Minister saying we are going to tweak or review at least the individual
and
travel plus the Shenzhen multiple.
And what you see, right, is that the smugglers have decreased. Clearly, there's been some directive to say just cool it for a bit, maybe take 2 weeks off, right? So places like Shatin and Shengshui and these
people
places,
putting up photos,
photos go, there's no smugglers, right? And what people they might be the authorities in China might be saying we'll just keep it cool for 2 weeks and then you can come back. But people are learning, wow, that made a difference.
Yeah,
that made a difference. That's what our
made them listen.
So it definitely works.
But do you think that this kind of incident, like individual people got beaten up, or not beaten up, but got caked, and would that affect the image of because in the umbrella movement or revolution, the protest in Hong Kong is quite peaceful. It's certainly that these people coming up and then shouting at other people, like the mother and the baby, and then the baby crying, and this kind of image. Would you say that it will have a bad image? And
I don't think that, first of all, I don't think these people who are doing these protests are connected to the umbrella movement. So they were part of the umbrella movement, but they no longer represent the umbrella movement at all.
Okay.
So and then secondly, I don't think they're really concerned. They are concerned about image to a certain extent, but not to the extent that people in the umbrella movement were concerned about image.
Right.
And so what they're concerned about is results. Right? They're concerned about results and like how do we create a protest that gets results, right? So and their idea, I guess, I was thinking in the car when I was driving here today, and I was thinking it's kind of like trying to break an egg. You can
make an omelette.
If you and I don't want to go in that cliche that like some eggs have got to get broken. Right. But if you want to break an egg, right? If you march 100,000 people past the egg, it ain't gonna break.
Right.
Doesn't matter how many people you put on the street and peacefully walk past the egg and go, egg, please break. It doesn't work. And
you have to break it yourself.
You have to just go up there and go, pop the egg. So, and that's what the power of these protests. The power of these protests are, when the last umbrella movement protest happened, there was 13,000 people who did this protest, and everybody poo-pooed them and went, 13,000 people, that's rubbish, right? But if you put 13,000 people doing this type of protest, you will rock Hong Kong to its foundations, right? It's like a force multiplier.
Definitely.
So this is the difference between these protests. And like I said, that doesn't mean you'll have 13,000 people shouting at women with children and kicking over an old men's carts.
It's just a small minority.
But what around the edges, obviously there's going to be people who are behaving badly.
Sure.
But for the majority, they're just putting over a message, and I think eventually you will have 13,000 people doing this.
And we got to cut it off right there. But thank you so much for coming in, Richard Scotford. You can find Richard on Facebook. He's very active there. Just search Richard Scotford. That's 1T Scotford. And you can also check out his website, chinaopeds.com. You have Twitter as well, right?
Yeah, on all the protests, I'm twittering every 2 minutes.
Oh, what's your Twitter handle?
At Richard Scotford.
At Richard Scotford. Oh, nice and easy.
Yeah.
And our final segment is going to be our Shame on You award. We know who it's going to be. Fanny Law.
Fanny Law. Such a Fanny.
Such a Fanny. So, she's coming up saying, go to China, get brainwashed there. We got to have these videos in the schools. La, 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 la. Like, why don't you just let some independent thinking happen? But that's an anathema to a communist regime. I just think it's ridiculous that she's saying that, and she definitely deserves it this week.
I love her message to other legislators when she asking people to support the New Technology Bureau and saying that if you don't support that, you're not helping Hong Kong, and the God will kill you or something like that.
But
best
Albert
lobbyist in Hong Kong
had the WhatsApp message.
Shame on you.
Award, and so enjoy that.
Yeah.
And thank you for watching our show today. It was a 40th episode. That's wonderful. 40 episodes.
Yes, 40.
Congratulations.
So thank you. And so we'll be back next week as usual. Thank you.